I was very excited about having Beth this morning. The Wagner family has been farming in Montana for over 100 years now, and we also have I have family members with livestock operations in both North Dakota and a dairy here in Minnesota, and it's nice to hear somebody who talks about the agriculture industry as an actual industry with innovation and trying to increase their scale, rather than, I feel like often the conversation about ag is about, some sort of cultural values about rural communities, like that we're still in the field cutting down our wheat with scythes or something. So it was good to see that. But I'm here to talk about Montana. Where is the slide advance? Just the green button? This one. Thank you. Sorry, technology. There you go. The big story in Montana is our worker shortage that we've been having. This is every conversation we have with the Chamber of Commerce, the businesses in the state of Montana, is about workers and finding more workers. This chart shows the Montana and the U.S. unemployment rate going down from the last two recessions. Montana's unemployment rate has been about 4% since about 2015 right here, a little lower than the U.S. So we've been in this tight labor market situation for a little bit longer than the nation overall. In some ways, this provides really great things for workers, of course, lots of job opportunities, and we in Montana have experienced strong wage growth. Montana is the sixth fastest state for wage growth for the nation over the last 10 years, with growth at 2.7%. Of course, that's very common across with North Dakota and South Dakota also beating Montana in this metric. I think we'll get you next year. I'm trying it anyway. And then strong wage growth throughout the nation that we're starting to see as the national economy has a tighter labor market. We're finally starting to see that worker wage growth. The wage growth we've been seeing because of our tighter labor markets in Montana since an earlier time frame, we've been seeing that wage growth for just a longer period of time. I'm going to skip through a couple slides here because I'm a little over on time, and well, they were boring anyway, so you didn't want to see them. In Montana, we are seeing some signs that the labor shortage is slowing our employment growth and possibly our economic growth as well. This chart shows the gains in our employment, and this is the number of people employed over the last 10 years. And then the orange line is our job openings in Montana. So the demand for workers continues to grow, but we're not seeing the same level of job growth in the last 3 years that we've been seeing in the past, despite the increase in demand, and that's simply a constraint on our supply side. So that is having an impact in Montana. Good things, of course, in terms of workers' wages, but bad things in terms of businesses being unable to expand. This chart is our forecast of what's going to be happening in the labor force and the unemployment rate moving forward. And we do see that in about 2025, the demographics of the state of Montana change, and we start to have a little bit greater labor availability at that time. Montana has also helped in our labor shortage by having a lot of migration from out of states. In fact, we're the only 9th district state that has positive net migration that's pretty significant. We get about 38,000 people moving into the into Montana and about 30,000 moving out, so that's net migration about 8,000. I know that doesn't sound like a lot of people, but it actually is. That's about how much our job growth has been in the last few years. So this increase of migration from people from out of state has really been fueling the employment growth that we've had. So definitely constrained labor markets. Of course, the in-migration we get in Montana is a lot of people who are coming to Montana for the lifestyle that we have, and it is actually making our state younger. The in-migrants tend to be more educated than the Montana population currently, and also tend to be younger. So this has changed our demographics. I also like to include this slide is maybe a little bit of lobbying that next year maybe the conference could be in Montana. I got lots of support for that. By the way, this is actually actually showing the new chair at Big Sky Mountain, which is 8 skiers on it. I haven't ridden it yet, but I'm looking forward to doing it later this year. Our GDP growth in Montana has been a little bit, I would say, volatile quarter to quarter in the last few years, and this is because of some changes in the ag sector and in the energy sector, which we'll be talking about a little bit. Earlier in, this goes back to 2014, and in 2014 and even prior to that, Montana and the U.S. Were more stable in their GDP production in each quarter, and then as we move past when we start to have the impacts of both the coal industry right here in 2016 and 17, and then also ag tariffs, both of those industries have very inconsistent GDP production, and that has made Montana's GDP production also very volatile quarter to quarter, making it very hard for us economists to forecast things. However, on an annual basis, Montana is still doing quite well in terms of GDP production, and we continue to do fairly well overall. However, agriculture, I mentioned, has been one of the causes for some instability in Montana. Between 2016 and 17, we had a 30% drop in our real GDP from this sector. I know we've already heard a lot about agriculture and some of those things that are causing that with the lower prices, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but focus mostly on the macroeconomic impact. It was a 30% drop in our GDP, but overall agriculture makes only about 5% of our GDP. It's right here in this, here's ag and forestry. So certainly it isn't, that drop in GDP hasn't sent the state as a whole into turmoil or anything. We're still doing well with all of the growth in our other industries, particularly in the professional services industry. Montana has a very fast growing tech sector in the Bozeman area that has been doing very well and adding a lot of income to our state. However, for the counties that are highly concentrated in agriculture, this loss in GDP has been pretty significant and has slowed our economic growth a lot. This chart shows what the agriculture GDP is of a percent of your total GDP across the 9th district states. So you can kind of ignore the blue and the gray. It's the green counties that are interesting. If they're light green, that means that they have more than 10% of their GDP is coming from agriculture. Just for comparison purposes, roughly 2% of the nation's GDP comes from agriculture. It's about 2.5% here in Minnesota. North Dakota and South Dakota are much higher at 10%. So having 10% or more of your GDP coming from agriculture is pretty highly dependent on that one industry. And some of these with the darker green counties are those that get over 20%. In fact, there's one county that goes up to 75% of their GDP from agriculture. So while that impact of the agriculture overall has been pretty low in terms of the state level impacts, it has really impacted local counties. I also wanted to highlight a recent study that was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research just last month that researched the impact of the tariffs on other industries in these rural communities. And this researcher found that in the counties that have been highly impacted by the tariffs, there was significant consumption drops of roughly 5%. So that has been impacting the other industries within these rural communities as well. And then a 1 to 1.5 slowdown in job growth that they estimated with that. This study was focused on Iowa, and so it may or may not be fully relatable and generalizable to other populations, but it is the most recent study I saw on this topic. We're going to skip over that one too. So as I mentioned before, whether or not that ag GDP shows up in your overall state's economy, I just wanted to show some of the impacts on the other states, and this is at the full state level for Wisconsin and Michigan. And while Montana's GDP did have that 30% drop in 2007, Minnesota and Wisconsin also had some impacts, but the other states are showing stronger. I think this, in some ways, is more interesting from a political discussion perspective of if the impacts of the tariffs have not been obvious in every single state and in every single community. I think that changes the political discussion about the outcomes of the trade wars and how that has impacted our communities. Back to Montana for a little bit. Did you notice my other lobbying that we might? Oh, there we go. Just in case you wanted to come. So Montana is a very diverse state. We're pretty big, and what drives our economy is significantly different on the western portion of our state than the eastern portion. And these are two areas of the state, the southwest, which includes the town of Bozeman that I mentioned is having a very strong growth in the tech sector now, and then also the northeast, which is Missoula and Kalispell, have been growing pretty rapidly, exiting from the recession, and have had very strong growth. However, the more ag-dependent and energy-dependent areas of our state have not had as much growth. The North Central is highly dependent on ag, and that has been hasn't been performing great, right? And then South Central includes a lot of coal mining and had some slowdowns of growth when we had lower coal prices here in 2016 and 17. And then Eastern Montana follows a pattern that I think our North Dakota economists will recognize very well, really with the growth driven by the energy boom in Eastern Montana with the Bakken, huge growth, and now is coming down after that. Still some positive growth from the overall development though. And I wanted to include this chart also to talk about our reservation areas in the state of Montana. We have 7 reservations, and they are, I think, they have a lot of impact in Montana because they take up a lot of our space not take up a lot of our space, I suppose, but they do have a pretty large impact on our overall economy and in the regions around that. In particular, the Crow Reservation and Northern Cheyenne reservations have been impacted by the closure of the Colstrip power plant and the impacts in coal with decreased coal revenues. It has been very challenging for these two reservations because so much of their travel revenues were dependent on coal. And so it's not just the drop in the coal industry itself, but also a drop in the tribal government revenues, which then they needed to cut some of the government in employment and other providing other services. So we had a spike up. The Crow Reservation actually spiked up to 20% unemployment in the last several years, and is thankfully back down to 14% now. But as we move forward with the closure of a major coal-fired power plant in Montana, this will be an area of impact that we're watching. I'm going to skip over that one too. I spoke about the Colstrip power plant. The Colstrip power plant is the largest coal-fired power plant on the Montana side of the Mississippi River. It makes up roughly about half of the power that we produce in Montana, and Montana is a pretty large exporter of power. So it is kind of an important discussion in our overall economy and our output, particularly in our exports. The part of the plant has closed down in January. The rest of the plant is still kind of uncertain in what will happen. There is significant environmental impacts from this plant. So there's 2 different questions that are really kind of something that we need to be answering in the Montana economy in the next few years. And one is, how do we make up that power in terms of exports? How do we encourage that energy development to make use of the resources we have in terms of the transmission lines and the workforce? And then the second part of this, the local community will be going through a lot of restoration in the next few years. So there are job opportunities in environmental cleanup for the workers who have been working in the coal mine and the power plant. So that will be a nice way to kind of minimize the impact of this. But because these restoration plans are not yet finalized, it's hard to know what the impact of the overall closure is going to be on the larger economy. So that's my takeaway points today. We are doing pretty good. We're having nice wage gains in Montana, which is really something that our economy needs. But we do have some challenges coming up. what's going to be happening to the agriculture tariffs is one of those challenges, and also there's still some remaining questions about what happens in our coal industry. But overall, what's happening in Montana is I mentioned two industries that are more traditional industries that are kind of having challenges, but the rest of our economy is actually growing really well, and overall that means that Montana is transitioning to more knowledge-based economy versus more industrial and agricultural economy overall. So, thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. So yeah, as Casey mentioned, Mark Wozni is the state economist for South Dakota. In that role, I work in the governor's budget office, work on modeling the economy for South Dakota as it relates to estimating tax revenues for the state. So the way we kind of look at employment and wages is going to be, a little bit through that lens. The governor rolled out her proposed budget just last month for the state of South Dakota. We modeled the economy going out to 2021 because we're estimating revenues for fiscal year 2021. I know the focus of this is kind of looking at 2020. I included that data for our model in 2021, but I'll keep my comments focused on 2020. I'm going to start off high level, looking at a couple of points that we like to track for the state's economic health. And so this is real GDP in billions of dollars here. Between 2010 and 2018, GDP grew at an average rate of 1.8% in South Dakota. We can see that we had a little bit of negative growth in 2017, and I think we kind of talked about the economy and the challenges we've seen there. I'll touch on that a little bit more here later. When we did this forecast in October, looking out to 2019, what the rest of 2019 was going to look like in 2020, 21, we estimated 2019 ending at 2.7%, and then 1.8% in 2020, and 2% in 2021. We did this estimate September, October timeframe. I think anecdotally a lot of the data's come in and been better, and so we're kind of excited to see what it looks like when we look at it. So looking at non-farm income, about 63% of South Dakota's tax revenue comes from our sales and use tax. We have a broad-based sales and use tax, but we don't tax a lot in the ag sector. Obviously an ag-dominated state, we try to support that as much as possible. So looking at non-farm income is a pretty important metric for us to understand what consumers are going to have to spend. Annual growth from 2010 to 2018 was averaged approximately 4.3% in South Dakota. We've had a really tight labor market for quite a while in South Dakota, like the rest of the country, and we've been a little bit stumped why we haven't seen stronger growth in incomes and wages. We've had sporadic growth, particularly 2012, 2014 were good years, but 2013 was actually a negative year. 2018 came in at 5.4%, so that was a good number for us to see. We're a little more cautious looking forward into 2019 and 2020, 4.1% ending the year in 2019, and then looking at 4% in 2020. So this is a chart that we like to look at in South Dakota. Obviously has a large ag sector. We do have one area that we have focused tax revenues from, and that's that we have an excise tax on farm machinery sales. So, we talked earlier about 2017, we had negative real GDP growth. We've talked a lot about it here. We can see our farm economy, farm income bottomed out in 2017, and that's what led to that negative real GDP growth that we saw there. We've seen some recovery. The red line here on the right-hand scale, that's our estimated tax on that farm machinery. We've seen some good recovery in that, and in 2019 so far it looks like it's still going. I don't have an estimate for that though. So next I'm going to look specifically at employment wage outlook. We're going to look at some data points that are included in our economic model for South Dakota, and then we're also going to look at some labor market information center data. Overall, employment and wages forecast is modeling, kind of what we expect for the overall economy. Strong growth in 2019, and then still good growth in 2020. South Dakota unemployment rate is historically low, historically been lower, one of the lowest in the country. We can see, we recovered from Great Recession levels of about 5%. We're forecasting 2019 to end at about 2.88% unemployment. As we move into 2020, we're forecasting on an annualized basis to be at about 2.74%, in 2021 2.6%. So getting back to the pre-recession bottom that we had in unemployment rate going into 2021. In terms of employment numbers, we've seen pretty good growth in the number of workers, averaging 1.1% between 2010 and 2018, and recovering to our pre-recession levels in 2016, and then just adding from there. As Barb talked about and Beth this morning talked about, workforce is an issue that we hear and speak about very frequently in South Dakota. We have a number of programs that seeking to increase workforce, both by keeping people in state and then trying to attract workers from out of state. You might have heard about a recent campaign that South Dakota did related to meth. That's not our first kind of foray into interesting advertising techniques. You might remember a few years ago when a lot of people were signing up to go to Mars, South Dakota ran an ad campaign that says, "Why go and die on Mars when you can come and live in South Dakota?" So we like to make headlines with our advertising campaign, obviously. Yep, it's still going. Yep. So if you haven't heard, South Dakota, we've got a meth problem. I think regionally there's a meth issue going on, and we came out with a campaign that says "Meth, we're on it." I think it's kind of dually meaning, obviously, it catches a little tongue-in-cheek there, but also trying to say, hey, we need to focus on this issue. Everybody needs to focus on this issue and tackle it. So, yep, meth, we're on it in South Dakota. But it seems that these programs are working. See, maybe the Mars ad worked. I know Barb kind of showed us here a slide that showed net in-migration was negative in South Dakota. We look at IRS data, which is a little bit different, and so what that's showing us is that we're actually a positive net in-migrator, and the migration that is occurring is in higher wage jobs. So in 2017, which is about the best we have, it's about 1,000 jobs. I know that's not big numbers for the rest of the region, but it's a pretty good number in South Dakota. Especially in the context of what we're adding. 2019, we're expecting to be a really good year, 7,800 jobs or 1.8% growth. Looking to 2020 to again, moderate, adding 2,600 jobs or about 0.6%, and a similar number in 2021. So, kind of moving to the wage side of the equation, we talked about calling for a neutral farm economy in 2020, and that's going to carry over in real per capita personal income. You can see, we're pretty flat from 2019 to 2020. We're expecting good growth in 2019, but flat going forward. And we're just not projecting any major disruptions in the ag sector, and so that's what's kind of coming through on this chart. Trying to get more focused in on wages. Our forecast, we forecast non-farm personal income, and this is on a per capita basis here. We're forecasting growth of about 4% in both 2019 and 2020, which comes out to an increase of about $1,800 in each year. So pretty good growth for South Dakota there. Trying to understand what's driving that growth. We'll look at some labor market information center data. So this chart here, at the top, that's total employment. We've got the estimated employment in 2016, and then a projection 10 years out from that. At the top, all of South Dakota. The next 5 categories are the top 5 gainers in South Dakota, and that's the black. And then the red are the bottom 5 categories for this group. So looking at this chart, we can see, 4 of the top 5 are sectors that have an average wage above the 2018 weekly average wage. So we're seeing really strong growth in high wage positions. When we look at consulting services and professional scientific and tech services, that's consulting services. Healthcare is a big one. Management, obviously seeing growth in good jobs. At the bottom here, ag is still growing at more of a kind of normalized rate for the whole state. And then we'll only have one negative growth area that we're expecting, and this is kind of what we're seeing. And then the information center, that's going to be related to the movement of publishing from, like a print publishing to online. And so that's kind of driving that. So overall, you can see we're seeing good growth in high wage jobs. And then looking at healthcare, which when you can see when you start, that's our largest sector by far in terms of number of employment, and that's got good double digit growth. And that serves as a good segue into our sector spotlight. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably wondering why the guy from South Dakota is here highlighting the healthcare sector. Why not ag or financial services or maybe manufacturing? Those are the things that we think of when we think about South Dakota. And those are important parts of our sector or of our employment. But I think another thing that isn't really seen or talked about in South Dakota is our healthcare sector. South Dakota serves as the headquarters to 3 large healthcare companies. Avera on the top left there, that's going to be the state's largest employer with over 12,000 employees in the state. The company also operates facilities in Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. So a regional employer and regional company that's headquartered in South Dakota. Sanford Health is a global healthcare provider with locations throughout the 5 states that Avera serves, with additional healthcare clinics in Oklahoma and California. And then internationally has healthcare clinics in China, Ghana, Germany, and Canada. And then the company also recently acquired the Good Samaritan Society. So now offers, has senior living facilities in 26 states. Overall, that company employs 48,000 people worldwide, so a large company that's headquartered in South Dakota. Monument Health here, it's going to be the smallest of the 3, and its operations are focused in the western, more sparsely populated part of the state, as well as eastern Wyoming. The company employs about 4,500 people, mostly in South Dakota. But big news for that company, it used to be called Regional Health. Recently, they're going through rebranding, and they announced that they're going to be partnering with the Mayo Clinic here in Rochester. So good news for them. So looking at our model, what's included in our model for health services employment, between 2010 and 2018, category average 1.6% growth, about half a percentage point better than overall employment growth per year. Growth is projected to be 2.3% in 2019, and then 1.5% both in 2020 and 2021. So that's about 1,500 jobs in 2019, 1,000 jobs in 2021. This chart here gets a little busy, has lots of colors, but I'll walk you through it. Shows health services employment annual year-over-year growth versus total non-farm employment growth. So on the left, in the gray and the dark blue, that's going to be our year-over-year growth for health services, and then on the right bar in yellow and light blue is total employment growth. So we can see we're outpacing generally total employment growth in the health services sector every single year, except for 2014 and 2015. Looking out to 2019, good growth, and 2020, we expect to outpace total employment growth by about 1%. So taking a look at wages, our model doesn't specifically look at healthcare services wage growth. It gets rolled up into a higher category. So we look kind of labor market information data to get an idea of what's going on with wages here. We can see that the highest growth is expected to occur in the ambulatory healthcare and hospitals categories, and those are our highest wage sectors in that grouping. This chart here, also another little bit busy one, but we can see it breaks down in the green. We have ambulatory healthcare, blue hospitals, orange social assistance, and then purple nursing and residential care. So that's all of the lower level groups that make up that sector. And then in the yellow with the dots on it there, that's the healthcare and social assistance group as a whole. And then overlaid on top of that is the total growth for all wages. So this is annual growth for those categories by year. It looks like we've got an anomaly in the data in 2013, probably a large employer moved from one to the other, kind of showing that data. But overall, we can see that the healthcare group moves in concert pretty well with total wage growth. And so, what we can infer from that is, we looked at non-farm income growth. We know a big driver of non-farm income growth is going to be wages. We looked at that growing about 4%. So I think we can infer that would be a good expectation to have in 2020 for the healthcare sector as well. Overall, in 2020, we're forecasting another strong year of growth. The model, like I said, was put together in October. We're seeing some slowdowns in global growth and sentiment at that time. I think if we think back to September, October, everyone was kind of saying probably going to be a recession in 2020, 21. I think a lot of that data's come in. It's been different. We've seen recovery, sentiment's changed. So we weren't. We're hopeful about what the next one looks like. We're going to be doing another modeling here next month for our legislative session as we finalize revenues for that. As we have good data come in, we're hoping that improves. And so we'll put a lot of that data out on our website there, the BFM website. I've included here, and then the labor market information. And so thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks again, Mark, for your presentation. We've got about 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for some Q&A for both Barb and Mark. And so I hope you've been thinking about some questions to pose to our economists and our experts that just presented. But I'll get us kicked off here. And I wanted to ask a question to Barb to start, really reflecting on your slide about positive net migration. And that it's the highest in the district. And knowing sort of quite a bit about the state of Montana, knowing that we're looking to fill about 115,000 jobs or so in the next 7 or 8 years with some retirement of our baby boomers. What role is that net migration going to play in the overall strategy for the state to be able to accommodate filling those positions?
So that's a good question. The number Casey was referring to of the 115,000 replacements is actually the number of people in the Montana labor force who are 55 and over and expected to retire in the next 10 years. Now this estimate actually does include the fact that older Montanans and older Americans are continuing to work longer. So it's possible that it could even be an underestimate, but that represents over 20% of our workforce in Montana. And this is not a problem just for Montana. The baby boomer population is actually global, right? And so a lot of the concerns about the workforce and the labor market are about, one, how do we replace those workers when our younger population is simply not large enough to help fill those positions, and also, of course, the loss of knowledge and experience that we're also having when you have a retiring older worker and replacing them with a younger worker. I think that has always happened, right, but maybe not to the extent that it's currently happening. So in Montana, the migration is really key to helping fill that 20% of our workforce who are not going to be there 10 years from now. And it is really, without that migration, I think that we would be in a scenario in which our employment growth would be significantly lower. We've been noticing the impacts of a very tight labor market on slowed employment growth for several years now. I think that there's other signs of that tight labor market as well. Montana actually has a very high rate of part-time jobs, not because we have not as many full-time jobs, but because we have more people working part-time jobs instead of not being in the labor market. So there's other signs that there's some take-up of people who otherwise would be out of the labor market. But yes, that migration is key for us to continue our job growth in the future. And I mean, not that this is the ultimate of any economic analysis, but I don't think that's much of a coincidence that we get about 6,000 workers every year, and that's about what our job growth has been in the last few years as well. So.
Thank you, Barb. Maybe a similar question to Mark. I know South Dakota last year led the nation in number of workers that had multiple jobs. And that being a fact, and kind of looking at your projections for an additional 6,000 workers or so in total employment over the next couple of years, where is the state looking to sort of resource workers from?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I think the state is looking internally. Obviously, we talked a lot about economic development in South Dakota. Barb, you had a great slide that showed your reservations and your prevalence of unemployment there. We have similar issues in South Dakota, very large tribes, very high unemployment there, and that's an area that we're constantly evaluating. Outside of those, it's really, really tight labor markets. So people talk about brain drain in South Dakota. We try and fight against that. We think, as I talked about with the IRS data, people are coming in that make more money, and so we're getting people that come in and less people leaving. And so we're trying to keep the kids that are coming out of college. We don't want to export workforce, and then we're just constantly looking to our surrounding states, sorry everybody, to try and attract people. We have a low regulation environment trying to attract the companies, and that's going to bring in the workers is what we're trying to do. Keep taxes low, keep the quality of life high, and that's what our efforts have been so far.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions? We've got mics over here and over here. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, this gentleman in the back.
Hi, Bob Thompson from Mars and Power. You mentioned the taxes. I don't know if there's been a study done on the rural areas, but it seems like we're just constantly reading articles about more people migrating to the lower tax states and away from the high tax states. Have you guys? If Beth was around, it'd be interesting to see if they've done a study, on Minnesota, Wisconsin, which are higher tax states, versus North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, which are lower tax states. But it sure seems to be an advantage, especially in your rural areas, if you get broadband with the lower taxes. But have the economists studied that to see, it turns into a huge political issue, but is there a lot of studies that are just, are people truly migrating to the lower tax states? And where do you guys consider yourselves in that area? I know we're South Dakota Lions.
I could take a stab at it. I guess going back to that IRS data where we showed us being a net gainer, and I would say that's a trend that's different than a lot of northern states. When you look at that same data and you look at like a state like Illinois, no offense to anybody from Illinois, but obviously has a higher tax burden. They're losing 50,000 jobs a year to that. So while we haven't studied it specifically, I guess in danger of towing the company line, low taxes and that are a big attractor for employers and big attractors for individuals looking to keep more of what they earn. And so I would say, yeah, it's true. I guess we'll have to see if the data keeps kind of showing that out.
From a Montana perspective, I think that when you have low taxes, you obviously also provide less services, and then there's also a mix of tax types. To say one state has low taxes in terms of income taxes doesn't consider that they probably have very high property taxes in the same state. Montana doesn't have sales tax, but that does mean that our income taxes are slightly higher than some of the other states as well. So in many terms, there's lots of trade-offs there. But going back to, when you have a tax burden that is a little higher, you're also funding better education systems, and you're driving a lot of other types of workers that come into your economy. In Montana, the focus of our business community has been on recruiting and retaining a successful and well-trained workforce. Our Chamber of Commerce has been very active in putting businesses and community colleges, our higher education systems, and even our high schools, and working with them to collaborate on getting a stronger workforce. And all of those systems and that worker training are funded through tax dollars. And so there is some trade-offs there. While taxes are a concern for every single businesses will pay out more money in wages than they will pay out in taxes. And so while there is always trade-offs, it's important to remember that businesses care about those education systems and the worker training systems in addition to taxes.
Yeah, question in the back.
Right here.
Good morning.
My name is Ben Askirka. I'm with United Bankers Bank in Bloomington, Minnesota. And my question, you've been talking a lot today about the low level of unemployment, the tight labor market, nationally, the unemployment rate at a 50-year low, well below the Fed's natural rate of unemployment, as they term it. Why is inflation remaining so stubbornly low? And do you think the Phillips curve is broken, or are faster wage gains just around the corner?
I love this question. There's about, I would say, 50 people in this room that can answer the question better than me. You know, it's super interesting, isn't it? And I think my focus is on the economy in Montana and not macroeconomic policy. We've been closely watching monetary policy and the actions of the Federal Reserve and the research that are coming out from the Federal Reserve. And you guys do a great job.
Wonderful question. I wanted to actually maybe shift a little bit to make some connection between some insights that Beth had and the healthcare industry in South Dakota, Mark. Just making the assumption that a lot of the growth in healthcare has been in sort of the urban areas in South Dakota. And hearing from Beth this morning that there have been 120 rural hospitals that have closed recently. What sort of trends do you see in the state of South Dakota? And maybe you can respond as well, Barb, about so where is rural healthcare in both of your states?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I'm trying to look at the data that's out there that's available. You know, I showed those three companies. What's happened in South Dakota is that we've had a great deal of consolidation in those three companies. It's really hard to get publicly available data now because of that consolidation. That's considered the number of employers is too low. But you know, I have anecdotal evidence that says, yeah, there's a lot of issues that we see there. We're seeing nursing home facilities closing in rural areas at a really high rate. That's been a big issue in South Dakota. Some of that related to reimbursement rates, some of it related to the population is not there anymore. And so hospitals are closing in South Dakota in rural areas. We're always keeping an eye on that. We're working to expand healthcare opportunities, looking to, we have a number of programs to get healthcare providers into rural communities and pay off a doctor's student loans and stuff like that. So, it seems to be stemming the tide. We're making investments in telemedicine. So I think we're seeing a shift maybe from doctors and high-level healthcare professionals in the rural community to outreach clinics that are staffed by PAs or nurse practitioners and nurses, and then consulting on a telemedicine basis. And that's just the reality. It's hard to attract those people to a town of 1,000 people or 12,000 people. That's a big town in my state, but so it's challenging. But I think South Dakota is working to meet that challenge.
In Montana, we did pass Medicaid expansion both earlier, 2 years ago, and just recently, and that was a very critical part of funding our rural hospitals. There is a number of rural hospitals, and the association said that they likely would have to close if that legislation had not been passed. So that has helped our rural communities. Having grown up in a rural community, boy, there's a lot of struggles. But I think the providers that we have in the state do an awesome job at trying to provide healthcare services to our rural communities. In particular, the healthcare providers in Billings come up to Northeast Montana. Even when I was in high school, my orthodontist came up from Billings once a month to tighten my braces, right? So thanks to him for the smile. But like my parents, they fly down to Billings to get their back surgeries and their doctor's appointments, and then have follow-up appointments in Glasgow in our local community hospital. So there's a great deal of cooperation there, and I think it's a struggle for sure, but they're very dedicated people to providing services in our rural communities in Montana, and I give them props for keeping that going.
Thank you. We have time for about one more question.
Since I've got the microphone, I guess it's going to be me. But
Can you stand up?
Actually, I'm coming off a hip operation, so if you don't mind, the answer is I could, but then I'd fall down. I've got actually two questions for the lady from Montana and the coal strip plant closure. Is that going to leave ratepayers paying for what they call stranded assets or unamortized costs, because we've got a similar situation going on in northeastern Minnesota. And then for both of you, at the same time that there's historically low unemployment and a shortage of workers in ag and other places, there's persistent chronic high unemployment on the Indian reservations. And since the Indian reservations are in rural Minnesota, you wonder whether we've got ships passing in the night, you know. Is there some kind of a cultural problem? Are Native American Indians unwilling to leave the reservation to find work? Are employers in the resort industry or ag unwilling to hire Native Americans? It's, you know, it seems I've been looking at that for 20 years and there's no movement. You know, unemployment on the Red Lake Indian Reservation in Minnesota is 65%. You've got farmers who can't hire workers. You've got resorts that can't hire workers.
I can start on that one. Just briefly on the reservation issue and then moving to Colstrip. I share your concerns about these communities and some of the challenges that the economies present, and also how do we integrate more with the businesses on the reservation, and how do we get them into our financial systems and our, I know that the Fed has done a lot of work on the Universal Tribal Commercial Code, so there's lots of efforts that are ongoing to do some more things to help reservation economies, but it is a challenge. That's one of the reasons I became an economist, actually, is because our family farm is on a reservation, and I grew up in a border community, and I saw a lot of the disparities, and you know, why is this such a challenge? It's something that has motivated me, and I think motivates you and many others in this room, I believe. As for Colstrip, it's an ongoing question. So there was a settlement that required 1 and 2 to close. By 2022, they actually closed early because of market conditions. They closed just this month, just last week. So that is about 1/3 of the plant. The other 2, the 66% of the power that's in the units 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, are still kind of an ongoing conversation. And there's 6 different owners of the plant, and several of those owners have gotten out and paid for the entire restoration of the plants. Prior to this, we had a fairly large settlement, both for the restoration fund for 1 and 2 is probably going to be over $400 million at the end of that. So they are the state's working. The state of Washington has been working to provide some cleanup funds for the community, but it is a complex issue because it involves many different jurisdictions. It's a regulated industry and multiple different business owners. So is it a challenge that we're keeping an eye on? Absolutely. But I think in some ways we've done a good job of making sure the liabilities are funded.
And to touch back on the tribal areas, you know, I think all of us would say it seems like a basic equation, workers that need jobs and employers that need workers. You know, obviously life's not that simple. I think you touched on, you know, the cultural issues there. You know, what we talk about in South Dakota is culturally relevant economic development. It's not going to look like economic development does in non-tribal areas, you know, and working with employers to understand that. We also talk about education being really important in those areas, and working with our tribal partners to see how we can best serve them and help them, you know, address the challenges. You know, I don't think there's an easy answer for that. wish it was just the equation, but it's a lot less harder than that.
Well, we've run out of time, but I did want to just mention that, and Barb brought it up, that here at the Minneapolis Fed, we do have one of our key institutes is the Center for Indian Country Development, and we're asking those similar questions around how do we grow our labor and make connections between opportunities in Indian country with an available workforce in Indian country, and we're excited to see some of the work that's happening on early care and education and that role that's playing to prepare our young Native Americans for the workforce down the road. So just a little plug that you'll continue to see sort of the research that we're doing here at the bank through the center and the convenings that we're having, particularly with this population.